Welcome to another episode of Foreword, the podcast series brought to you by ISS ESG, the responsible investment arm of Institutional Shareholder Services. I'm your host, Mara Souders. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Laura Albarracin and Hernando Cortina. Laura serves as Vice President of ESG Product Management for ISS ESG, and Hernando is ISS ESG's Head of Index Strategy. Stay tuned as Laura and Hernando dive into the SDG Impact Rating and the SDG Index Series. Both of these offerings by ISS ESG are designed to help investors align their portfolios with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Thanks so much for joining me today, Laura and Hernando.
Thank you so much, Maura, and delighted to be here with Laura this morning. Laura is product manager and architect of our recently launched SDG Impact Rating, which is a very exciting product. Today, we're going to talk about what this product is and then turn to how we are using it to build ESG indices. So with that quick intro, Laura, could you please, tell us a little bit about what the SDGs are and how they are relevant to investors? I know many are familiar with them already, but a quick background would be really helpful.
Absolutely, and I'm very happy to be part of this podcast today talking about a topic I'm very passionate about, which is SDG investing. And going back a little bit in the history of the SDGs, they go back to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted by the United Nations on the 25th of September 2015. So this year it's actually kind of the 5th anniversary of that agenda, and this resulted in the development of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are an established and, very importantly, also globally accepted set of goals in areas such as water, health, poverty, biodiversity, climate, so many important areas of sustainable development. And what was very interesting about these goals when they were first defined was that they were, unlike their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, very unique in that they spoke to a broad range of stakeholders. So not only being directed to countries and politicians, but also very much including and involving the private sector as an important stakeholder in pushing the goals forward. 5 years after, the picture and overall progress on the development of these goals is very mixed. In fact, we've seen some positive developments in some areas. For example, in a recent report, the UN Secretary General highlighted that it's very positive to see kind of an increase in financing for green or renewable energy projects, which of course has an important impact on SDGs related to climate change. But there are other areas such as targets regarding to hunger, education, healthcare, where we're significantly lagging behind. And one of the main reasons for this is a financing gap, a very significant financing gap, which has been estimated by the UN Secretary General at $2.5 trillion per year. So knowing that financing is kind of a big hindering aspect in achieving these global goals, we know that investors can play a pivotal role in closing this financing gap. And they can do so not only by investing new capital in projects or issuers that are aligned with the SDGs, but also by redirecting existing capital away from, so to say, negative alignment towards positive alignment opportunities. PRI released a report, which is a 5-part framework for investing with SDG outcomes. And in that report, they reflected on kind of the evolution of how investors are thinking about SDGs. One of the things that I thought was very insightful was in 2006, only approximately 2% of PRI reporters were even mentioning the SDGs in their PRI reporting. And in 2020, this has increased to 31%. I think the numbers will continue to increase as investors continue to recognize this as a viable framework for investment. And it's very exciting to be able to create products that can help and facilitate this investment path.
Wow, thank you. That's super helpful. That's great background. So with that as an introduction, how would you say the SDGs are relevant to investors right now? What kind of investors are adopting them? And how is ISS ESG supporting those investors?
Great questions. I think we see it already in our client base that it's across the line. There's many different use cases for how investors are trying to incorporate SDG data into their investment decisions. Our work with SDGs actually started already in 2016. So while we only recently launched this SDG Impact Rating, we've already had a predecessor product, which is called the SDG Solutions Assessment, already since 2016. And back then, we were approached by some of our clients who were looking to have access to data to measure the alignment of their portfolios with this newly released kind of globally accepted framework. And of course, back then, understanding the SDGs was the first step in this kind of evolution, making sure that we are able to kind of extract what elements of those SDGs are actually relevant to investors that can actually lead to investable solutions. What we thought would be kind of the best first step in this direction was to measure companies or investee companies' alignment to the SDGs through a products and services lens. So we started, first of all, creating a framework for assessment where we would say, okay, how can we categorize the products and services that a company produces and with which it generates revenue according to their SDG alignment? Are they being kind of supportive of specific goals? And very importantly also, are they detrimental to the achievement of those goals? And very early on, we recognized that alignment to SDGs can not only and should not only be measured on a positive kind of, this is a positive investment opportunity, but it's also very important to be aware of any negative or detrimental outcomes that investee companies can have in those SDGs. So we built this framework based on products and services. It's very detailed, very granular, again, looking at the positive, the negative, different shades of positive and negative, so it's not very binary. And we're measuring alignment based on revenues generated with specific products that can fall within the positive or negative category. And we received great feedback, but then again, as the SDG conversation continued to evolve and investors started to understand more clearly how they wanted to incorporate this into their investment use cases, we started to notice that there was also a gap in understanding and measuring company or investee company impact. Because if you look at it solely from a products and services perspective, you're missing a very important part of how companies can impact the SDGs, which is through their own operations. So kind of in a second step, we decided to take this products and services assessment to a second level and say we need to start understanding investee company performance more holistically. Again, taking in products and services, which is a very important element of it, but adding to it, how do companies through their operations, so as corporate actors themselves, can have potentially also a positive, but also negative impact if they're not managing negative externalities in their operations adequately. And very importantly, a third pillar to it is the involvement in controversies. So kind of basing on the idea that overall SDG alignment should look at positive opportunities coming from maybe innovative products and services, as well as minimizing any harm you can have on specific goals or specific targets through your operations and through the involvement in controversies. And that's exactly what this newly launched SDG Impact Rating looks at. We look at company alignment to the SDGs through this three-pillar lens: products and services, operations, and controversies.
That's great. Thanks so much. So from an ESG index perspective, for me, the three most important things are always data, data, and data. And this data set is super rich from a data science perspective. It's got a lot of granularity, a lot of dimensions. Can you maybe tell me a little bit about what would an investor sort of receive if they get this data set? What kind of, information they get for every company, and how many companies you are assessing right now?
We're totally in agreement that the need for data is something that we hear often from our clients, and specifically granularity and transparency in how we come about to kind of assess a certain company with a specific score. So the product is built in such a way that for each individual company that we cover, we deliver an overall SDG assessment or an SDG score that is based on the assessment of the underlying 17 goals. For each of the companies, we then have for each of the individual goals an assessment that is based on three pillars: products and services, operations, and controversies. The way it's built up, it's kind of from the bottom up. So we start with the three pillars: products and services, operations, and controversies per goal. We then aggregate those three scores to come to an overall goal assessment. And then from those 17 goals, we come to an overall SDG impact assessment at an issuer level. And this is very important and interesting because it not only allows you to have kind of an overall impact of the company, but if you're more interested in specific themes, and this is something we hear often from clients, they say, well, we're trying to align our portfolios to our own investment philosophy, and we want to know specific or target specific SDG themes that are closer to our investment philosophy. So we want to maybe focus on climate, or we want to focus on gender diversity. So you can actually, through the data set and how it's built up so granularly, actually do those deep dives in individual themes that might be of more relevance or more interesting to you as an investor.
Perfect. So let's take a specific example. The world and companies are a complex place. How do you handle companies that may be on one hand supporting one SDG goal, but on the other hand obstructing others? How do you make that decision as to what the overall score is when companies have conflicting operations and impacts?
That's a great question. And I think we can think about it in two ways. First of all, there can be conflicting performances or objectives across SDGs, but also within one SDG in the different roles that a company takes. So we'll start with that latter part. I think a very interesting case is when we look at companies in the pharmaceutical sector. So here we have the majority of companies, per definition, their products and services have a positive contribution to the objective related to health and well-being. They produce medicines that help alleviate diseases, and so through the revenues they generate, they have a positive impact on this goal. If we look at it, however, from the holistic perspective, which is kind of the added value of this product, we might also identify companies within that sector that through their operations are actually, despite having positive products and services, having a negative impact on this goal. For example, if they don't have adequate systems in place to guarantee the safety of the products that they're selling, for example. Or if we look at it or take it a step further, if within the operational realm, they're not guaranteeing access for its medicines to populations most in need. So there's different elements where you can actually say, not only because you have a positive product and service is your kind of net on net impact on a specific goal positive. So the way we approach this is through a kind of a netting lens. So in the way in that we've built our aggregation model, you are able to see the impacts of the individual pillars. So you might be able to say and recognize for a company, oh, I see they have very positive products and services, but they're lagging behind in their operational management or are involved in controversies. And we then net these kind of conflicting impacts to come to the overall goal rating. And this also is reflected at a goals level, so to say. So you might have a positive impact on climate, for example, but have very poor labor policies and measures and management of your labor relations, which means you're having a negative impact on SDG 8, decent work. This would also be kind of accounted for within a netting framework for the overall SDG assessment, whereby we take in kind of your most positive impact and subtract your most negative impact from another goal to come to the overall assessment of SDGs. Again, because we believe that the overall SDG impact should account for any harm that is being done in specific SDGs before we can say you're net on net a positive contributor to the SDGs.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. So like I said, there's a richness of data and that allows you to kind of grasp the nuance across SDG pillars and across different SDG goals. So Laura, it's now been about, I think, 3 months since the second generation SDG Impact Rating was launched. Can you maybe give us some examples of how investors are using this data and any feedback you've received from the market?
Absolutely. So we've received very positive feedback. And again, I think what we hear more often is highlighting that we're following this very holistic approach. We're looking at impact from a positive and negative lens, which are things that resonate very well with our clients. I think the first step when investors are trying to kind of grasp and start thinking about SDG investment is measuring the alignment of their portfolios to the SDGs. So they use this data to kind of look at existing portfolios and say, how aligned or how much of kind of positive impact can we assign or attribute to this portfolio? Once they've done that, kind of that's the very first step of measurement, we start seeing that a lot of our clients are using this framework then to develop investment rules or investment decisions in portfolio construction, asset allocation. So maybe trying to improve the performance of the portfolio by redirecting capital towards more positive alignment opportunities and away from negative alignment opportunities. So that's kind of one of the main use cases we see for this data. Another very important use case is stewardship of investees. So in the area of engagement, investors might want to use this data to start even a conversation with investee companies about areas where they definitely see need for improvement with regards to specific sustainability goals. So this is also a very interesting use case of this data. And then last but not least, we see a lot of interest on thematic investments. So using kind of the goal ratings as carve-outs to build different products, be it a fund or an investment fund or whatever it is that the investor wants to build around a specific theme, be it climate. Diversity is a very important topic. Biodiversity is also very interesting right now. So they can use those kind of thematic carve-outs out of the goals to build thematic investment products. I think it's a great question, Hernando, on use cases, because I know that when we're talking about examples of how investors can use the SDG Impact Rating data, the work you've been doing recently on the SDG Index Series that ISS ESG launched in partnership with Solactive is a very interesting use case in and of itself. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what the indexes are, how are they built, and how they leverage this data.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. On the back of this product launch, we did partner with one of our index partners, Solactive, to build a series of equity indices that are built upon this data set. And as you alluded to, there are quite a few ways one could slice the data to create an index using SDG Impact Rating, and different investors will have different use cases. What we decided to do is to create basically two families, one of which we call the SDG Leaders, and the other we call the SDG Aligned. The SDG Leaders is the most demanding and maybe more concretely focused on the SDG data. So to be part of the SDG Leaders Index, every company needs to have an overall significant contribution to the SDG. So that's a score of at least 5 on that -10 to +10 scale. Not only that, you also cannot have a negative impact on any of the 17 SDGs. So companies that make it into the SDG Leaders will be, definitely highly aligned overall and will not in any way be obstructing any of the 17 SDGs. The second family of indices we call SDG Aligned. So those are a little bit looser, but perhaps more applicable to a broader range of investors. In the case of the SDG Aligned, every company needs to have a net positive score. So you cannot, it doesn't have to be as high as the SDG Leaders, but you need to be on the whole contributing to the SDGs and supporting them. Furthermore, the companies cannot have a significantly negative impact on any of the 17 SDGs. So you cannot be, causing major harm to any of the goals, and you have to be, generally aligned with the overall score following the aggregation that Laura mentioned. So it's two different families for two different use cases. The last thing I'll mention is that the Leaders Index is based on a global all-cap universe. So it's really global, consistent with the SDG concept. And the SDG Aligned, we offer a couple of different versions. One would be a global all-cap. We also offer a developed markets, large and mid-cap, depending on what the target investor base is.
Great. That's very interesting, and also very nice to see how it can be applied with investable solutions using kind of the granularity and scoring that the SDG Impact Rating offers. And talking a little bit more about the indexes, how has the reception been thus far? So what's the feedback that you've gotten? And maybe also a very important question, how well do these indexes perform?
Great. Thank you. It's been a really good reception because there's a very much positive feedback between the data and the indices. Clients are interested in the data, and the indices help them understand how they perform, and vice versa. People who are interested in the indices will also want to drill deeper into the data. I think one of the interesting things about SDG investing is that, the number of companies that are truly SDG leaders is relatively small in the world. So to give you an idea, the SDG Leaders Index is quite focused. Only about, 40 to 60 companies out of a potential index universe of 11,000 make it to the SDG Leaders Index. So it is quite demanding. And in fact, The number of companies that make it to this level is something that I'll be tracking over time because it gives us an idea of how the world, the corporate world at least, is aligning with the SDG goals. The Leaders Index has performed actually very well since inception. Just to bear in mind, the product is relatively new, so the most important aspect, of course, is performance going forward. But when we look at history since May 2017, based on current constituents, we've seen about 130 basis points of outperformance relative to the on-screen universe, which is quite good. Volatility has been also meaningfully lower than for the overall benchmark, which means you have some nice Sharpe ratios, for example. I'll also mention something that is really fascinating, is that if you took this index and did sort of a weighted average SDG score, you come up with 7. So 7 and that minus 10 to plus 10 scale. So this is really a very, very well aligned index with the SDG goals. I could mention some of the stocks in them to give you some examples. Some are, not so well known names. Others are well known. We have things like Infigen Energy, which is an Australian renewable power company. We have companies focused on immunology, Argenex. We've got some better known names, Owens Corning, which is a well-known materials company, Alstom in the transportation space. So we have a number of companies, both small and large, that make it into the Leaders Index. If I turn it to the SDG Aligned Index, here the investable universe is much, much larger. So depending on whether you choose the developed markets, large and mid cap, we've got about 690 companies. And if you look at the global all cap, we got about 1,300 companies. So it's much larger universes. Companies you'll see in both of these are much, much better known companies. So you'll have, your Microsoft, Johnson & Johnson, to give you some examples, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, Visa, MasterCard, these kind of well-performing ESG companies that are also aligned with the SDGs. And speaking about performance, they've also outperformed their relative benchmarks, although they track a little bit closer, of course, as you would imagine, compared with the Leaders Index. The SDG aligned global all cap has outperformed by about 70 basis points historically since 2017, with again very, very similar or lower volatility than the benchmark. And of course, you also get an overall much better weighted average SDG score. And also to give you an idea, this is interesting for our listeners. If you take an on-screen index, the SDG scored is close to 0, basically neutral. The market as a whole doesn't really contribute in a major way to the SDGs. When you look at the SDG aligned indices, the scores are in the range of 2 to 4. So not as high as the leaders, but also quite meaningfully higher than not doing anything at all. So you are seeing an impact while also having better returns, lower volatility, and much higher quality universe of companies.
Great, thank you, Hernando. Very, very interesting applications of the data, and very nice to see such good performance of these indexes. Maybe just to wrap it up, one last question. What do you think comes next in terms of SDG Index Solutions? So is there any possibilities to customize this even further, and what opportunities are out there for investors?
Thank you for that. These are relatively new, and so far we've seen a couple of potential investors interested in launching products based on these indices as they exist right now. I think one of the benefits of having such granular data is that we can actually also customize them. So, we have scores for each of the 17 SDGs, which means investors have the possibility of creating custom indices focused on one or more of the SDG goals. As you mentioned, you could create a biodiversity or climate change version of these indices. You could look at just social SDGs, environmental SDGs, education. So there's a lot of possibilities that are in place. We're also actually using the SDG Impact Rating data as part of our Paris-aligned indices, which have some constraints on aligning with environmental goals. So they're feeding into that as part of that process. So we're open to definitely a lot of customization for these indices.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I hope that we were able to provide a very comprehensive overview about SDG investment to our listeners today.
Thank you, Laura. So let me just end the podcast here with a question for you. Since you are SDG expert, you've got 17 SDGs out there. Which one is your favorite?
Oh, that one's really, really tough. I think it's very difficult to have one favorite over the other. I think what's very important about the SDGs is that they highlight a lot of social issues. And I think when we're talking about ESG investment, generally environmental topics are kind of at the forefront. So I wouldn't say they're my favorite, but I think it's a very important aspect of the SDGs that they're bringing kind of very relevant social issues to the table and to the discussion. So maybe if I would have to say I have a favorite, but I would say that looking at social aspects is something that I think is very valuable in this framework.
Thank you. That's great. And I think I would echo that. The environmental aspect is fascinating and something that I'm very passionate about. But in the current context, given what's going on in the world, we're seeing a huge amount of interest on the social side. And I think that the SDG Impact Rating really has a lot to inform investors and products on that regard. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you, Hernando.
Thank you, Laura and Hernando, for taking the time to discuss these great offerings by ISS ESG. If you have a question on this episode's topic, please feel free to reach out to our experts by email at podcast@iss-esg.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in next time to ISS ESG Foreword.